welcome on your behalf Mervyn Thomas, the founder of Christian Solidarity Worldwide, who is going to speak to us. And Mervyn, I move this for you, my friend, so that it's all clean and incapable of giving you any infections. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nigel, and it's very good to be with you this evening. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you too for, I know many of you here are part of the regular persecution prayer group, and which I believe was started many years ago when one of our staff members was at this church, Phyllis North. Actually, I think when she started, she might not have been North. I'm not sure, but she was. Okay, but anyway, thank you for your faithfulness, and thank you for the way that this church supports our ministry and supports those who are being persecuted for their faith. And just for those of you who don't know too much about CSW, CSW is an advocacy organisation. We are not, we don't provide aid, we don't deliver Bibles, we don't drill wells, we simply provide a voice for those unable to speak for themselves. And Proverbs chapter 31 says that we are to speak up for those unable to speak for themselves. And that's exactly what we try to do at CSW. Hebrews 13 and verse 3 says we're to remember those in prison as if we were in prison with them. And 1 Corinthians 12 verse 26 says that we are all part of the body of Christ. And when one part suffers, all parts suffer with it. And that verse is a little bit difficult for us. Actually, the rest of that scripture actually says that we are to. It says we are to. I've forgotten what the verse is. I just said it. That we are to suffer with those who suffer, but it also says we're to rejoice with those who rejoice. And we don't find that too difficult to do we? It's very easy to rejoice with people that are rejoicing, but is it easy to suffer with those that suffer? And and persecution, of course, has been with us ever since the beginning of time. If you read through Hebrews chapter 11, for example, that great chapter of the heroes of the faith in the Old Testament, you'll find many examples of those that were persecuted. They weren't Christians because they weren't Christians then, but they were believers in the one God, in the true God, in our God, and the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And people like Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, people like Daniel. And they were people, of course, that God delivered from persecution. But there were many others too that weren't delivered. If you read the last few verses, and we haven't got time this evening, although Nigel, you read a lot of verses there, and they were fantastic scriptures. But some verses at the end of Hebrews chapter 11 talk about two groups of people, basically. Groups like Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego who were delivered, but it also talks about those that weren't delivered, those that were sawn in two, or today we'd probably describe that as being beheaded, those that were tortured, those that lived in caves and holes in the ground. So persecution has always been around, and some of those scriptures that Nigel read tonight, and Jesus said we can expect to be persecuted. As Christians, if we are followers of Jesus, we can expect that. We are fortunate in the UK that we are not persecuted. But do you know, something like 84% of the world's population live in countries with high or very high restrictions on religious freedom. That's staggering, isn't it? Most of the world live in countries with high or very high restrictions on religious freedom. And what we do in CSW is that we speak up for those people, both Christians and non-Christians too. We speak up for them in Parliament, we speak up for them at the EU, we speak even after Brexit, we still speak up for them at the EU. We speak up for them at the United Nations, where we have status, and on Capitol Hill, and many other places around the world. We provide a voice for them. And let me just explain as I said, we don't just speak out for Christians. And, you know, when we started this ministry over 42 years ago now, when we started the ministry, it was in response to persecution in the old Soviet Union, the old Soviet bloc, Eastern Europe, and which was where there was much Christian persecution. And of course, in 1989, communism fell all over Europe, and so suddenly there was no more persecution in Eastern Europe, although sadly things are going backwards a bit in some places today. But we had to reassess ourselves after 10 years of operation to say, you know, are there other Christians in the world that are being persecuted, apart from Eastern Europe? That's all we knew about. And suddenly, of course, we realised that there was a whole world out there, and particularly the Islamic world, but also many other countries where Christians were persecuted. And so of course, we carried on our work, and it was while we were working in Burma some 20 years or so ago, when we were speaking up for the Christian Karen and Karenni ethnic groups, that one of my staff came to me and said, look, I've just come back from Burma, and there's a bit of a problem, because it's not just Christians suffering. There's a group called the Rohingya Muslims. Now, most of us today have heard of the Rohingya Muslims. They've had quite a bit of coverage, but in those days, nobody was speaking about them. And so we said, well, what do? Do we just speak up for the Christians and ignore the plight of these other group just because we don't agree with their theology? And you know, please don't get me wrong, friends. I believe that Jesus Christ is the only way to God the Father. I'm a Christian. That's what I believe. But I also believe that we're all made in the image of God. And I also believe that God gave us a free will, so to freedom to choose which path we follow. And he also is a God of justice. And so, to my mind, it was quite simple. We had to speak up for people of other faiths too that were persecuted. And so we have done that, and we've done that since that time. And of course, you know, and if you go, I haven't got time tonight, but if we go through the Bible, you'll see time after time after time. Even the verse I quoted tonight saying, speak up for those unable to speak for themselves. It doesn't just say speak up for Christians, it says speak up for those unable to speak for themselves. And Jesus' story of the Good Samaritan, of course, is a great example where the man who came to Jesus wanted to know who his neighbour was. He was hoping that Jesus was going to give him a list of a few people that he could tick off his list as a Pharisee and say, yep, they're my neighbour. But Jesus said, everybody is. And the story he then told of the Samaritan was the hero of that story was somebody who Jews hated and they didn't get along with. So that's why we do what we do. And I just want to tell you in the short time that we have got tonight, just perhaps some of the few places where, and let me just say, although we speak up for people of all faiths, you know, there is no doubt that the most persecution against people of faith is against Christians in the world. Other faiths are persecuted alongside Christians very often. In India, for example, Christians and Muslims are persecuted. In Pakistan, it's Christians and Hindus. And in different parts of the world, it's different groups. So most of our work is for Christians. But let me just tell you, perhaps 2 or 3 countries. China, of course, is a country which we're all we've got a pretty good idea that there's persecution going on in China. And of course, more and more in the news recently has been the plight of the Uyghurs in China, the Uyghur Muslims, although they're not all Muslims, actually. There are Christian Uyghurs too. But the Uyghurs as a ethnic group are being ethnically cleansed, if not having genocide committed against them. And we're very careful in CSW about using the word genocide because it's a legal term and there is a legal definition of genocide. But we believe that genocide probably is happening against the Uyghur people in China, and we are not alone in thinking that. And of course, even in this, in fact, in the last couple of weeks, Our Foreign Secretary, the Canadian government, the American government, and the EU have all sanctioned, individual sanctions against individuals in China who are behind the persecution of the Uyghurs. But, you know, that is getting a lot of coverage, which I thank God for. But we don't hear much about the situation of Christians in China. And the church in China, even though it's probably the second fastest growing church in the world, does anybody have any idea where the fastest growing church is? You can shout out behind your masks. Any idea? You might be quite staggered. The fastest growing church in the world is in Iran, which of course is an Islamic theocracy. But the church is growing faster in that country than anywhere else in the world, and that's an amazing story and a story for another time. But the church in China is growing too, and there probably are something like 130 million Christians in China. Most of those are in what we call the underground church, or in churches that meet secretly. But there is a big official church called the Three Self-Patriotic Movement, and that is the church that is sanctioned by the government. And so the government always, when they refer to the fact that we have religious freedom in China, they mean that only those people in the official church are free to worship. But let me just tell you, even in the Three Self-Patriotic movement today, and the situation in China, just let me say, is the worst for religious freedom and human rights than at any time since the Cultural Revolution. It really, maybe 10 years ago, things were beginning to improve, but it's gone backwards very, very quickly. And so let's just say this church was a Three Self-Patriotic church, and you came to this church because it was legal to come to this church. Well, let me tell you, it is a legally registered church, but there are 5 classes of people who are unable to attend a Three Self church. If you're a member of the Communist Party, you couldn't be a member. If you are a member of the armed forces, you couldn't attend the church. If you are a government employee, you couldn't attend the church. If you are a student at university, you couldn't attend the church. And if you are a minor under the age of 18, you can't attend the church. Now that completely cancels out a whole lot of people, doesn't it? And I'm sure that there are maybe not members of the Communist Party, but I'm sure there are other groups that even are part of this church. And so, but how do they police that? How do they check? Well, I'll tell you how they check, because now they have outside, if this was a Three Self church, as you came in tonight, there would be CCTV cameras. Inside this church, all around the church, there will be CCTV cameras. And they are not ordinary CCTV cameras. They are face recognition cameras. And so they can check your face with your identity card. They match them up, and if you are one of those 5 groups, you're likely to get a visit from the secret police. That's the situation in China today for Christians. And I could tell you many other things too. Many Christian lawyers, and it's Christians so often, not just in China, but in other parts of the world, it's Christian lawyers and Christian pastors that speak up against abuses of human rights. And because they speak up, they find themselves in big problems. Cuba is another place where Christian church is left alone, but if the church speaks out about human rights, then they find that they're in big trouble. So I mentioned China, I mentioned India, and I can't see that clock at the back there. I think I'm all right at the moment, am I? Then India. So India, which is a Hindu country and is run by the BJP, which is a Hindu nationalist party. And India is the worst country and you might not realise this because India's always talked up. People think India's a great country. And in many respects it is, but it's a big, it's becoming a big economic superpower, and people want to do trade with India. Yet there are huge problems. It's the worst country in the world, according to the Pew Forum. It's the worst country in the world for societal violence against Christians and against religious minorities. So in that case, it's against Christians and against Muslims and against Sikhs. It's the worst place. So there are attacks on religious minorities almost every single day in India today. We have reports regularly, as I say, several times a week of attacks against Christians. And these Christians, and some of them are terrible. Some of them result in death. Some of them, we had one recently where a pastor was beheaded. We have, and this is in India. And the problem, one of the problems is that the people that do this, the people that are attacking the religious minorities, are Hindu nationalists, and they believe that they are being good Indian citizens by doing this, because BJP is a Hindu nationalist party, so it must be good. And the problem is that very, very rarely, if ever, are the people that perpetrate this violence against the minorities, rarely are they ever brought to justice. And in fact, the first thing you do in those countries, in India, Pakistan, in Nepal, when a crime has been committed, you file what's called a first incident report at the police station. And the police so often in India refuse to even take those reports and file the reports. So people get away with it. There is impunity, and with impunity, of course, that encourages everybody to do it. All the time, you're going to get away with it, you're going to do it. And so that's what happens in India. In Nigeria, this will be the last country I'll talk about, but in Nigeria, the situation in Nigeria, again, is bordering on genocide. In fact, the all-party parliamentary group for freedom of religion or belief in Parliament, which incidentally is the biggest of all party parliamentary groups. There are over 120 members of all parties and all faiths who are members of the APPG on FORB, of freedom of religion or belief. And they recently published a report on the situation in Nigeria. And the report was entitled, "Nigeria, an Unfolding Genocide?" ? Is this a genocide, what's happening? Well, I can tell you, whether it is or not, if it isn't, it soon will be unless action is taken. We have Boko Haram operating in, so those who don't know, Nigeria is roughly 50% Christian and 50% Muslim. Most of the Muslims live in the north, most of the Christians live in the south. But there is a thriving church in the north, and and in the central belt, there's a good mixture. In the far northeast is where Boko Haram operates. Boko Haram is a terrorist group, and the words Boko Haram actually mean against Western education for girls. That's why we keep hearing, and I say we keep hearing at CSW. It doesn't always get into our newspapers, sadly, or in fact it rarely does, but constantly they're kidnapping girls from schools and holding them. And there have been a number of those cases. In fact, there was a case, it was 3 years ago. 3 years ago in February, they took 110 girls from a school in Dapchi in northern Nigeria, and they kidnapped these girls, and the government negotiated their release, and 109 of them were released back to their school and to their village, and one person was not. And the reason that one person wasn't sent back with the other girls was because she was the only Christian in the group that had been kidnapped. But they gave her a choice. Leah Sharibu, her name is, 14 years old. And they gave her the choice. She could either convert to Islam and be set free with her friends, or she could stay as a Christian but stay with them. and she chose to not renounce her faith in Jesus. Now that's incredible, isn't it, for a 14-year-old girl? I don't know about you, friends, but I'm a pretty strong Christian, I think, but even I don't know what I would have said in that situation. There are people that sometimes pretend to convert, but in their hearts they don't. I don't know what I would have done, but I do know that 14-year-old Leah refused to convert, and because of that, 3 years on, she's still there. On May the 14th this year, she will have her 18th birthday in that camp. And we know that the Nigerian government could secure her release. And I can't go into why we know, but we do know they could if they really wanted to. But she is still being held. And in fact, on the 14th of May, we are holding, and if you're interested, you can go onto our website at csw.org.uk. We're holding a 24-hour of prayer for Leah on her 18th birthday. So we have the Boko Haram, but then in the central belt of Nigeria, and particularly bad in Kaduna State, in southern Kaduna, we have a group called the Fulani militia who are operating. The Fulani are an ethnic group actually all over Nigeria, but suddenly, and they're nomadic herders, and they usually herd their cattle onto Christian farmers' lands, and the Christians tell them to go away, and off they go somewhere else. But suddenly, over the last few years, these Fulanis, who are Muslims, have become armed with AK-47 rifles and rocket launchers. Suddenly, they've got all this weaponry, and they are killing and massacring Christians in the Central Belt. I know, I've been there, I've seen some of these villages where the Christians are being killed and are living a terrible time. And our government, the American government, and the rest of the world are actually sitting by in silence. That report that I just told you that the All-Party Parliamentary Group produced, our government is saying, no, this is not really happening. Even our government. And they're saying, well, yeah, there is some killings, but these are just intercommunal gangs fighting each other. It's got nothing to do with religion. Well, I can tell you there are other reasons, but the main driver for this violence is religion. When you get groups, when you get 50 motorcycles driving into a village with 2 people on the pillion firing left and right and shouting Allahu Akbar, Allah is great, and killing people, you don't tell me that's not driven by religion. So I've just given you a very brief picture of some places in the world. What can we do? What I can tell you, because this is one of the things that troubles me the most, we need to wake up as Christians. Whenever I go to these places, whenever I meet Christians, wherever I go, whether it's Iraq, whether it's Syria, whether it's Nigeria or India or China, wherever I go, they say so often, the Christians say to me, we thought the church in the West had forgotten us. What a terrible thing to say. We thought we'd been forgotten. And so what can we do? What should we do? I'm going to tell you 3 things we can do. One is we can pray, and thank you for your prayer group that faithfully meets. And I trust if you're not a member of that prayer group here tonight, you'll join, because these people deserve your prayers. We have it so easy in this country. We have it so easy, and yet we are so comfortable in our churches. You know, have I got 2 more minutes? Last time I went to, well, not the last time actually, but anyway, I went to southern Kaduna, to a village that had been attacked by the Fulani, and the Fulani were all around the village even while I was there. And I took my 17-year-old, this was in 2017, my son was 17 years old, and he'd always wanted to come on a trip with me. And so this happened to take place in his half term. He was in 6th form, and he said, Dad, can I come? And I said, well, this is probably the most dangerous place in the world that I ever go to. I said, but, you know, so it's probably, no, Dad, God's given me all this reassurance about courage, and his mum really didn't want him to go. It's funny, she never minds me going, but anyway, there you go. That's, but he came, and we went to this village where 22 people had recently been massacred in the village, and we met them in their kind of village hall, and I prayed with them, and that's all you can do, you know, is put your arms around them and pray with them, and to say to them, because we're not an aid organisation, I promise I'll tell your story wherever I go. I promise, and I'm doing that now. I promise I'll tell your story in Parliament. I promise I'll tell your story at the United Nations and on Capitol Hill. And that means so much to them to hear that and for you to pray with them. But the reason I'm telling the story, because as we left the village, my son said to me, Dad, he said, it should be compulsory for every British Christian to come to this village. I said, why? He said, because, do you know what, Dad? He said, these people are dying of starvation because they can't go into their fields to farm because the Fulani are out there. So they're frightened. He said, they're being killed one by one. They brought a boy in. He said, a 15-year-old boy had a bullet in his leg that had been there for 3 months, and his leg was so badly infected. The stench was awful. And he said, Dad, these people have got nothing. And yet I saw when you were praying with them, he said, the joy in their hearts was amazing. He said, but people in our churches moan and complain about everything. Of course, they don't at St Andrew's Cheam, I know that. But don't we? We find so much to whinge about. And yet these people have got nothing. They are dying for their faith. They're living awful lives. The least we can do, brothers and sisters, is to stand up and to speak out. So we can pray for them, we can advocate for them, we can speak out. If you go onto our website again, you'll find that you can write letters to your MPs. Write letters to your MPs about the situation in Nigeria. And it does make a difference, I promise you. But all I can say is, and you can write letters too, letters and cards of encouragement. We've got a booklet on I haven't got any with me, but we've got them on the website called Connect and Encourage. And it's an address book where you can send letters and cards to people who are being persecuted. Simple thing. But all I want to finish by saying is, please, if you take nothing else from my little talk tonight, please take this. There isn't an option to remain silent. All the time we know about this and do nothing, we are complicit in what's going on. I'm sorry to have to say that. It's a horrible thing to say, but it is true. If we know about it and are silent, then we're as every much as a bit to blame. If we think it's just too much, we just couldn't, I'm just one person. Yeah, but if everybody thought like that, there'd be nobody standing up and speaking out. We can all do something. Thanks very much, Nigel.
Thank you, Mervyn. I asked Mervyn beforehand if he'd be willing to take just a few questions, but you need to give him permission, because in terms of timing, that means we might take another 5 or 10 minutes of our service. But if you've got any questions that you would like to ask Mervyn, we'll keep it to about 5 or 10 minutes. You're very welcome to do so. And Nigel is going to bring around the roving mic. So if you would like to ask a question and you'd like to put up your hand, please do. Margaret is just here, and then Austin next. The microphone's coming, Margaret.
Thank you very much for that talk. My husband and I, in our married life, have lived in Iran, we've lived in Malaysia, and we've lived in Indonesia. And I'd just like to perhaps see what the situation is in those countries, because we went to church in Indonesia even, but it's 90% Muslim.
It's what, sorry?
90% Muslim.
Yes, of course, yeah. And one of the problems in in all of the countries that you've mentioned, and in Islamic countries generally, I was in Malaysia a couple of years ago and preached at a big Pentecostal church. And afterwards, I had lunch with the pastor, and I said to him, do you get many Muslims come to the church? Do you get many Muslim converts? And he said to me, oh my goodness, no, if a Muslim came into this church, I'd have to tell them to leave. And I said, well, why? Because he said somebody would take a picture of them in the congregation with their hijabs on. He said they'd put it on the internet and say this church is converting Muslims, and he said they'd shut us down. And so one of the problems in those countries is that there are churches that you can go to, but many of them are frightened to take in converted Muslims, Muslim background believers as they call them, and they're frightened of it because sometimes Muslims who convert to Christianity find themselves with not even a church to go to, and find themselves in nowhere. And of course there are groups that will look after them, but they do it. It's a very dangerous thing to do to pastor converts. So yeah, thank you for saying that. Thank you.
We this month are praying for India, as you know. It strikes me that our government will want to have a free trade deal with India. Is there a chance that the Christians in Parliament will insist that there is a codicil in that free trade agreement, that there is freedom for religion in that country?
Thank you. A great question. And let me just say, to start with, this is something that I sit on the Foreign Secretary's Human Rights Advisory Group, and it's something that I'm talking about all the time. We've got a great opportunity because we are negotiating trade agreements all around the world. So those countries that abuse human rights, and my particular interest is freedom of religion or belief, yes, we want to get those clauses in. Whether that will happen, we will just have to wait and see. We'll have to pray. But it's something that you can ask your MP when you know that these things are coming up in Parliament, and we'll often be able to tell you that. You can write to your MPs about that. But I mean, on India, and just an encouragement, just 3 or 4 weeks ago, I had a private meeting with Boris Johnson to talk specifically about religious freedom in India. And it was a miracle, in 40 years, it's the first time I've ever met privately with the Prime Minister to talk about this subject. So God opens those doors. But I have to say, at the end of my meeting, I was going to ask him if he would raise these issues with Prime Minister Modi in India, because that's what he needs to do. These need to be raised. But before I'd even got there, the Prime Minister said to me, "I'm going to raise these issues with Modi when I go to India later this year. This is disgraceful." That was his words, and he asked me to keep 10 Downing Street fully briefed on what was happening there. So be encouraged by that and pray for our politicians that they are prepared to stand up and speak out, and they are prepared to put their money where their mouth is, if you like. It's one thing for the Prime Minister to say that, it's one thing for an MP to say that, but when the rubber hits the road, it doesn't always happen. So that's where prayer comes in, but also your voices as well.
Any other questions from anybody?
Lady there?
Yes.
Oh, I thought you...
Matt?
I wondered whether, because Christians need written material, they need Bibles, they need information, whether that is getting access to that kind of material is a significant problem, despite the fact that the churches in places where they're persecuted do seem to be growing. I'm finding it difficult to imagine how they are able to grow where they must be restricted in what they can see and read.
It's a fantastic question, and and you've got to ask God that question, because so in Iran, for example, many people, whole villages are coming to know Christ because they have a dream about Jesus. This is happening in more than one place. A Muslim has had a dream about Jesus, has come to him in his dream, and he's got up the next morning and he's told his next door neighbour, and he said, "Oh, I had that dream too. And the whole village has had this dream and they come to know Christ. But yet, you're right, but then how do they get discipled? Well, that's, there are people that are able, and of course these days, some countries you can get, can get radio sermons beamed in, and etc., etc. You can get some teaching. But I want to tell you a story just to encourage me to talk to just that point. North Korea, which is probably the worst place in the world to be a Christian, in North Korea, which is the state controls everything. You can't even have a radio program beamed in. They've got one dial on their radio sets. You have to buy a government radio set, and it's welded to the one station that is that's the government propaganda station. But I met a lady in Seoul in South Korea a few years ago, and she'd escaped from North Korea, and she told me her story of becoming a Christian, and this was the story. She said that she'd been travelling in deep in the country somewhere for work. She was on a train station, and an old lady came to her and told her about Jesus. Now, first of all, that old lady was being pretty brave, because what would normally happen is the person that she witnessed to about Jesus would go immediately to the secret police and tell, because that's what they do. Everybody informs on everybody in North Korea. But this woman didn't. Instead, there on the radio station, on the railway station, she told me she accepted Jesus. And then she went back home, and she couldn't tell her husband even, because he would inform. She couldn't tell anybody. And then she escaped after a couple of years. She came, and I met her for breakfast in the hotel. And I remember she took out of her bag 2 exercise books. She said, and she wasn't speaking English, she was an interpreter. She said, "This is my diary of my Christian life in North Korea." So this is answering directly your question. I said, well, I was thinking, how on earth can you lead a Christian life when you've not got a pastor, you've not got a Christian book, you've not got a Bible, you've not got a Christian TV station? How can you do it? And so this chap started reading some extracts from it. And he started weeping as he was reading. There was scripture quoted in there. She was talking about God's grace. She was talking about things that she could never have known about if it hadn't have been for the Holy Spirit, I believe, directly discipling her. So those are things we don't understand, but God, I saw it with my own eyes. I met this lady who, and I believe when North Korea is free, and I believe it will be one day, because we are all praying for it, I believe when it does happen, we'll find lots of those kind of people in there. I remember when Albania, years ago, do you remember Albania, the only atheist country, when they said there was no church, when it came out of communism, suddenly they found groups of Christians everywhere. I believe that'll be the same in North Korea. But don't ask me to explain apart from the fact this is supernatural.
Mervyn, thank you.